The 2022 MLB season started after the owners locked out back in December. An influx of free agent signings came right before the season started. With a slightly late start, the MLB was in full go. New rule changes such as no Game 63 and replay were in effect. The season started with the World Series hopefuls such as the Yankees and Blue Jays starting out really hot, while surprise teams such as the Angels were as well. The playoff hopeful Phillies were slumping and the champion Braves were awful. Steve Cohen's plan was working out perfectly. May was a month of disappointment. The Yankees stayed hot, the slumping Dodgers got right, and the Angels started to collapse. The Phillies couldn't win, and the Sunday night thriller showed all of the Phillies' struggles in one game as they were swept by the Mets. The Phillies also blew a 6-run lead in the 9th inning to the Mets as well. The Twins were hot, and the White Sox were not looking like the World Series hopeful selves. June was a month of change. The 21-29 Phillies fired Joe Girardi and put Rob Thompson in as manager. The good but slightly struggling Blue Jays fired Charlie Montoyo, and the Angels, losers of 15 straight, fired John Madden. As soon as the Phillies fired their manager, they would go on a 9-game win streak, and the Mariners, who were declared dead by Trevor Plouffe, put themselves back into a playoff spot by the end of the month. But just as the Phillies were getting hot, Gene Segura broke his finger, and the worst nightmare Philly could ever imagine happened against the Padres. Just as the Phillies were getting hot, their superstar got injured. On the other hand, the Braves were an even more hot team as they won 14 games in a row and were catching up to the Mets. The standings were shook up by the end of June by a long shot. The Bryceless Phillies were still winning through July and put themselves back into the playoffs. Trade talks started to float around as teams such as the Cardinals, Brewers, Giants, Phillies, Orioles, Blue Jays, and Guardians were on the playoff bubble. The aforementioned Orioles were the surprise team of the year so far, as they were in contention for a playoff spot with arguably the worst roster in baseball. They brought up their catching stud, Adley Rutschman. Julio Rodriguez was showing himself to be a stud as well, as he was carrying his Mariners to a playoff push as a rookie. The teams we thought would be bad were bad, and the good teams such as the Astros with new stud Yordan Alvarez were rounding into form. And Trevor Plouffe's prediction was far from being correct. The beginning of August brought the trade deadline, and it would be one of the biggest in a while. Noah Syndergaard, Brandon Marsh, Darren Ruff, Jose Quintana, and Jordan Montgomery were moved, just to name a few. But the craziest trade of them all was when the Padres traded for Juan Soto from the terrible Washington Nationals. They gave up the kitchen sink for Soto, but it would be worth it, as they were without Fernando Tatis, who would be suspended later in the year. The Yankees would go into a month-long slump and give up the one seed that they had held all year to the Houston Astros. Bryce Harper came back for the Phillies, but was not himself as he slightly slumped at the plate. The Brewers were putting themselves back into the playoff race after giving up their first place spot to the Cardinals. And oh yeah, some guy named Aaron Judge was getting to a point that he may chase history. September brought slumps and hot streaks. Craig Timber started in Milwaukee as they would catch a month-long slumping Phillies for the final wildcard spot in the NL. The Phillies would hang around and give themselves a chance for a red October. The Mariners were in a tight chase with the Blue Jays, Rays, and Orioles and would be hopeful of breaking their 21-year playoff drought. The Braves and Mets played a pivotal set and the Mets got swept. The Braves, who started out awfully, caught up to the Mets and overtook them right at the end of the season. We played a couple of October games due to the late start. Aaron Judge made history by breaking Roger Maris's record of 61 homers. And finally, 2 playoff droughts were over. It was time for October baseball. The new format made 3-game sets in the wild card. The Cardinals and Phillies would square off as the Phillies' Gene Segura and JT Realmuto would end playoffless careers as the longest tenured players to not make the postseason. They showed their worth. Gene Segura capped off a late comeback in Game 1, and playoff Bryce carried the Phillies in Game 2 to complete the sweep. The Padres would shock the Mets after jumping all over Max Scherzer in Game 1. DeGrom got the Mets back in the series in Game 2, and the Padres would pull off the upset in Game 3. The Blue Jays and Mariners would play, and the Mariners would sweep after the Blue Jays blew a huge lead in Game 2. The Guardians would walk off the Rays in 2 games as Oscar Gonzalez hit a walk-off homer in the 16th inning of Game 2. The DS was here. The Phillies would play the Braves, who owned them all season, and would split in Atlanta. They got back to Philly, and Red October truly began. The Phillies won both games in Philly by large margins and shocked the World Series hopeful Braves in 4 games. The Padres would take on the juggernauts in the Los Angeles Dodgers, and the Padres would jump all over them and absolutely shock them in 4, as the 2 wildcard teams would face off in the NLCS. The Yankees would play a tough series against the Guardians. Josh Naylor went off, Oscar Gonzalez kept popping off, but it was not enough, as Garrett Cole would finally show that he is worth the $300 million contract he signed in 2020. The Yankees won in 5. The Astros, along with Timothy Alvarez, would shock the Mariners as he walked them off to cap off an incredible comeback in Game 1, and Jeremy Pena would be a hero as he got an 18th inning go-ahead homer in Game 3. The Astros swept the Mariners. The 2 teams who were on a collision course all year would face off in the Yankees and the Astros. The CS was here. The Phillies would win 5 out of the first 5 games at home in the 2 series that they had played. and they would go to the World Series for the first time since 2009. The Yankees would get simply owned by the Astros, as some fans would call for them to lose so that they could fire their manager. They didn't, and they got swept. The Phillies, who hadn't lost a game at home in the postseason, and the Astros, who hadn't lost a game in the postseason period, would face off in the World Series. Philly stole Game 1. The Astros came back in Game 2. Philly would win Game 3, but Game 4 was a different animal. The Astros threw a no-hitter. Game 5 was stolen by the Astros thanks to Jeremy Pena and a clutch grab by Chas McCormick. But the swing of the season shook up the game and ended the season for the Phillies. The Astros won the 2022 World Series, ending most hate for the cheated 2017 World Series. Dusty Baker won his first, and Jeremy Pena was World Series MVP. Judge and Goldschmidt would win MVP, and the 2022 MLB season was finally in the books.